If you have ever wondered whether the locks and the badges where you work are ever actually tested by anybody, the answer is yes. And it is stranger than you think. Adel, Iowa, a small county courthouse, just after midnight on the 11th of September, 2019. 2 men are inside the building. They let themselves in. Then they set the alarm off on purpose, because setting it off is the entire point. When the deputies arrive, the 2 men hand over a signed contract. They are being paid to do exactly this. They are arrested anyway, and they spend the night in a cell. The charges were dropped 4 months later. 6 years after that, in January of this year, the county paid the 2 of them $600,000. In the next half hour, I want to show you the job that put them in that hallway. What a penetration tester really does all day, and the one piece of paper the whole profession stands on. Start with the plainest possible definition, because almost every article you will read about this job gets the plain part wrong. A penetration tester is paid, in writing, by the owner of a system to try to break into that system and then to write down exactly how they did it. Every word in that sentence is load-bearing, paid, in writing, by the owner. And then, crucially, to write it down. Take away the writing, and you have a burglar. Take away the owner, and you have a criminal. Take away the report, and you have somebody who wasted an afternoon. The report is the product. That surprises people. They imagine the job is the breaking in. The breaking in is the raw material, the way footage is the raw material of a film. Nobody sells the footage. A client does not pay for the thrill of learning that their front door opens. They pay for a document that tells them which door, how badly, and in what order to fix things. Which means the best testers in the field are not the ones who get in fastest. They are the ones whose reports get read, understood, and acted on. There is a second word you will hear used as if it were the same thing: vulnerability scanning. It is not the same thing, and the difference matters. A scanner is a machine that checks a list. It compares what it finds against a catalog of known problems and tells you which ones might apply to you. That is useful, and it is cheap, and it is what a great many companies buy when they believe they are buying a penetration test. A penetration test is what happens after the list runs out. It is a person asking, given all of this, what could I actually do here that you would hate? A scanner will tell you that a door is unlocked. A tester will tell you that the unlocked door leads to a corridor, and the corridor leads to the payroll system. Chaining is the word for that. 3 findings that are each rated as minor, stacked in the right order, are frequently the thing that ends the engagement. And chaining is exactly the thing a list cannot do, because a list has no idea what your building is for. It knows what is broken. It does not know what you would mind losing, and those are not the same subject at all. So where does the word come from? Not from hacker culture, which is the assumption. It comes from a conference room and from people worrying out loud in 1967. Spring of that year. The Joint Computer Conference. Researchers from the RAND Corporation, among them a man called Willis Ware, sitting with colleagues from the National Security Agency. Their concern was very simple and, at the time, very unfashionable. Computers were starting to talk to each other over lines that anybody could reach. And the word they reached for what somebody could do to those lines was penetration. That is the moment the term enters the language in the sense we still use. Notice what that means. The vocabulary of this profession was invented by the defenders before the attackers had really shown up as a way of describing a worry. What follows from the worry is the interesting part. If you think a system can be penetrated, the honest thing to do is find out. So they went and found out. From the late 60s, groups were formed for exactly that purpose. They were called Tiger Teams, a name borrowed straight from military practice. A Tiger Team was given a system and permission and a deadline and told to attack it as if they meant it, and then to say what had worked. Read that description again and you have the modern job whole before most of the technology it now touches had been invented. Permission, a deadline, a real attempt, an honest account afterwards. Change the machines and none of those four move. In 1972, a man named James Anderson wrote the thing that turned an attitude into a method. It reads, 50 years later, less like a technical document and more like a job description. His report set out the steps a team should take, in order, so that two different teams attacking the same system would produce comparable answers. That sounds bureaucratic. It is the opposite. It is what separates a profession from a stunt, and those steps are still the skeleton of an engagement today. Then, in 1974, the United States Air Force commissioned an analysis of an operating system called Multics, and exploitable flaws were confirmed. That exercise is commonly described as the first recorded penetration test. Commonly described because earlier informal attempts are claimed, and none of them are documented well enough to say. What is not in doubt is the shape, permission, method, findings, report. 1974. Everything since has been detail. Faster machines, more of them, in more pockets, and the same four steps carried out by people who now do it for a living. Now, the part nobody puts in the recruitment advert, and the part the two men in Adel will have a great deal to say about. Under the law of most countries, accessing a computer you do not own without permission is a criminal offense. Full stop. There is no technical exception for good intentions. In the United States, the relevant law dates from 1986. In the United Kingdom, from 1990. Nothing I am about to describe is legal advice, and you should not treat it as any. What that means in practice is that a penetration tester spends every working day doing something that would be a crime, and the only thing standing between them and a cell is a document. So the document gets taken seriously. It has a name that sounds like a joke and is not one. The authorization letter, or, in the trade, the get-out-of-jail-free card. It says who is being tested, by whom, on whose authority, between which dates, and it is carried on paper by every person on the team every day. Around it sits the scope. Scope is the list of what may be touched, and it is written with more care than almost anything else in the engagement. Which addresses, which buildings, which subsidiaries, which hours, whether staff may be deceived, and if so, how far. Every one of those lines is in there because somebody once assumed the answer and was wrong. Anything outside that list is not a test, it is an offense, and systems in the real world do not respect the neat boundaries a contract imagines. A company rents a server. The server sits in a building owned by somebody else, on a network run by a third party, in a country with its own laws. Test the server and you may, without moving, have touched 4 organizations, only one of which signed anything. None of those 4 have agreed to anything, and 3 of them have no idea that you exist. That is not a hypothetical. It is the single most common way a legitimate engagement turns into an incident, and it almost never involves anybody behaving badly. It involves an address that belonged to somebody else by the time the contract was signed. Alongside scope sits the rules of engagement. If the tester finds something genuinely dangerous, who is called and how fast? That question gets settled in writing in advance because the middle of a test is the worst possible moment to be working it out. If a real intruder is discovered in the middle of the test, the engagement stops immediately, because from that second on, the tester is standing in a crime scene, and there is a named person on the client side, awake and reachable, whose job is to answer the phone at 3 in the morning and say, yes, they are ours. When that phone call works, nobody ever hears about the test. When it does not, you get Adel. We will get to Adel, and it is worth the wait, because almost nothing about it went the way anybody involved expected. Here is what an engagement actually looks like in the order it happens, because the order is the profession. Phase 1 is reconnaissance, and it is the phase that surprises people, because most of it involves no computers belonging to the client at all. The tester reads the company website, job adverts especially. A job advert for an engineer names the software the company runs in public for free. Conference talks. Public filings, the naming pattern of staff email addresses, which you can usually work out from a single press release. None of this is intrusive, and none of it is secret. It is the map, assembled entirely from things the organization published on purpose, by people whose job was to publish them, for reasons that were completely sensible one department at a time. Phase 2 is scanning and enumeration. Now the tester touches the client gently to find out what is actually there rather than what the documentation claims. Almost every organization of any size has systems nobody remembers. A test server from a project that ended. A supplier portal from a contract that lapsed. Forgotten systems are the tester's favorite thing in the world because a system nobody remembers is a system nobody patched. Nobody owns it, nobody watches it, and nobody is going to notice you standing on it. Phase 3 is the one everybody pictures. Exploitation. Actually getting in. In a well-run test, it is often the shortest phase of the week. Phase 4 is where the value is. Post-exploitation. The tester is inside and the question changes from, can I get in, to what does being in actually buy? Can I move sideways to a machine that matters? Can I read something I should not? Can I still be here tomorrow if you reboot everything tonight? That last question is the one that turns a finding into a headline, and it is the one a scanner will never ask, because persistence is not a property of a system. It is a property of what somebody did to it while nobody was watching. Phase 5 is the report, and the good ones are written for two audiences that want completely different documents. Getting that split wrong is how a genuinely good week of work ends up achieving nothing at all. The engineers need reproduction steps, evidence, and specifics, because they have to fix it. And they will not fix what they cannot reproduce. The executives need one page that says what could have happened, how likely it was, and what it would cost to make it stop. Write only the first, and nothing gets funded. Write only the second, and nothing gets fixed. Testers who can write both are rare and are paid accordingly. A word about tools, and then I want to be very clear about what this section is not. Because this is the point in every documentary about this subject where things go quietly wrong. I am going to name some categories and some dates. I am not going to explain how any of them work, and nothing here can be followed. The first tool that mattered publicly arrived in 1995. It was written by Dan Farmer and Wietse Venema, and it was called Satan. It checked a network for known weaknesses and reported them. Ordinary now. At the time, it was genuinely controversial because it handed the same view to everybody. That argument has never really ended. Publish the tool and defenders can see themselves the way an attacker does. Publish the tool and so can the attacker. The settled answer, more or less, is that attackers were always going to build their own, and defenders were the ones who could not. Then mapping tools which answer the question of what is actually listening on a network as opposed to what the asset register believes is listening. In 2003 came the framework everybody has heard of, Metasploit, which did something organizational rather than clever. It gathered scattered proof of concept code into one place with one interface so that testing a known problem stopped being an afternoon of carpentry. There are proxies for web applications which sit between a browser and a site so a tester can see exactly what is being sent rather than what the page implies. And there are prepared operating systems, Kali being the well-known one, which exist so that nobody has to spend 3 days installing things before starting work. Notice the pattern across 30 years. Almost none of these are attacks. They are instruments. They make an invisible system visible. Which is why the tools are the least interesting part of the profession, and why hiring someone because they can list them is a well-known way to hire badly. Every tool here can be learned in a week. The thing that cannot is knowing which question is worth asking of this particular organization. A tool tells you what is true. A tester tells you what is dangerous. Those are extremely different sentences, and only one of them can be automated, which is why this profession has survived every wave of software that was going to replace it. Now, the part of the job that has nothing to do with computers, and which, in most engagements, is the part that works. People are not the weakest link. That phrase gets repeated constantly, and it is lazy, and it blames the wrong party. People are the part of the system that was designed to be helpful, and helpfulness is not a defect. It is the reason the organization functions at all. A social engineering test is a test of whether the organization has given its staff any safe way to be suspicious. The simplest form is a simulated phishing email sent with permission to see how many people click and, much more importantly, how many people report. The click rate is the number executives ask for. The report rate is the number that predicts whether you survive a real one. Because a click is one person having a bad Tuesday. A report is a security team getting 11 minutes of warning, and 11 minutes is enormous. Then there is pretexting, a phone call with a story attached. The story is almost never clever. It is almost always urgent. Urgency is the actual weapon. Nearly every successful pretext is a manufactured deadline plus a plausible reason you cannot check. Take the deadline away and almost every one of them falls apart on the spot. Which is why the single best defense any organization has ever deployed is permission. Explicit, written permission for any employee to hang up and call back on a known number. It costs nothing. It requires no product, and it fails only in workplaces where hanging up on the wrong person is career limiting. Which tells you something uncomfortable. A social engineering result is very often a measurement of the company's culture wearing a security costume. The good reports say that. They do not name the person who clicked. They describe the pressure that made clicking the reasonable choice. Naming the individual is the fastest way to guarantee that nobody in that building ever reports anything again. It turns a technical finding into a personnel matter, and those are not the same thing. And a workforce that has learned not to report is a far worse outcome than the click you were measuring. You have not fixed the hole. You have taught the only sensors you had to switch themselves off. Which brings us to the version of the job that ends up in a cell. Physical penetration testing. The premise is simple. All of the network security in the world protects you from somebody who is outside the building, so the tester tries to be inside it. Sometimes that means locks. More often, it means a clipboard, a lanyard, a plausible manner, and a door that somebody holds open out of ordinary politeness. Tailgating is the word for that last one, and it defeats access control systems that cost more than the building's annual security budget. There are physical tools. Devices that reach under a door to reach the handle. Readers that copy an access badge from a pocket at conversational distance. And there are objects that are not tools at all until somebody uses them as one. In Adel, one of the things they used was a plastic cutting board. A flat piece of kitchen plastic, which is, in its way, the entire argument for physical testing, made in one object. Because the threat model in most buildings quietly assumes that an intruder arrives with intruder equipment, at night, dressed for it. The actual intruder arrives at 11 in the morning carrying a laptop bag and says, "Good morning," and everybody says good morning back. Physical tests are the ones clients find most upsetting because the finding is not a configuration error on a screen somewhere. The finding is a photograph of a stranger sitting at a desk in your office smiling, holding a cup of your coffee. That is also why they're dangerous to run. A network test that goes wrong produces an angry email. A physical test that goes wrong produces a call to the police. And the police, correctly, do not know who you are. They arrive to a report of an intruder, and they find an intruder holding a piece of paper. Every serious firm has a protocol for exactly that minute. Comply immediately. Say nothing clever. Produce the letter. Ask them to phone the named contact. It works almost always. Somebody picks up, confirms the names, and two people who are about to have a very bad year go home instead. The almost is the whole subject of the next 12 minutes. Because the protocol assumes that the person who signed your letter actually had the authority to sign it. That assumption holds almost every time. When it fails somewhere nobody thought to look. So, Adel, Iowa. Population around 6,000, the Dallas County Courthouse, September 2019. The Iowa State Court Administration, the body that runs the state's judicial system, wanted to know how secure its courthouses were, which is a responsible question for it to ask. It hired a firm called Coalfire, based in Colorado, to find out. The engagement covered both the digital and the physical side. 2 employees were assigned, Justin Wynn and Gary DeMercurio. Both of them carrying the letter, both of them doing what the contract described. On the 11th of September, they were inside the building during ordinary opening hours, which is not remarkable because it is a courthouse and it is open to the public. They came back shortly after midnight. They got in. and then they deliberately triggered the alarm because the contract asked them to measure the response. That is the part people miss. They were not caught. They rang the bell themselves. Being caught was the deliverable. The deputies who arrived found two men with a contract naming the courthouse and arrested them anyway on a charge of third-degree burglary. They spent the night in a cell. Reports of the exact number of hours differ, and I am not going to give you a figure the record does not agree on. Here is the gap that produced all of it, and it is not a technical gap. The state judicial branch runs the courts. The county owns the building, and the sheriff secures it. The people who signed the contract had authority over the court system. They did not have authority over the sheriff's building, and the sheriff had not been told. So the letter, which was real, and the contract, which was real, were signed by an organization that could not actually grant the permission being relied on. Every account of this case disagrees about something, whether the deputies checked the paperwork before or after, who was told what and when. I am giving you only the parts nobody disputes. What is not disputed is the ending of the criminal case. On the 30th of January 2020, the prosecutors dropped all charges. Dropped. Not reduced, not settled, not deferred. The two men were not convicted of anything, and any account that leaves that out is telling you a different story than the record does. The civil side took another 6 years. In January of this year, 2026, Dallas County agreed to pay the two of them $600,000. 7 years. From a triggered alarm to a settlement, for two people who did the job they were contracted to do and carried the paperwork that said so. And the lesson the industry took from it is not about locks or alarms at all. It is that a signature is only ever worth the authority of whoever signed it, and that verifying the authority is now part of accepting the work. There is a related job that keeps getting called the same thing, and it is worth 10 minutes of your life to be able to tell them apart. Red team. The words come from military wargaming, where the red side plays the adversary and the blue side plays your own forces. A penetration test asks a coverage question. Given this system, how many ways in are there, and how bad is each one? A red team engagement asks a completely different question. Given a real adversary with a real goal, would anybody notice? Coverage against detection. Those two questions produce very different weeks and very different bills. So a red team picks one objective. Reach the payment system, read the chief executive's mail, and then it tries to get there without being seen. Almost nobody in the client organization is told it is happening. That is not theater. It is the only way to measure the detection you actually have. Which makes the deliverable different too. A penetration test hands back a list of holes. A red team hands back a timeline. Here is what we did, hour by hour. Here is where your alerts fired. Here is where they fired and nobody looked. Here is where nothing fired at all. That last line is the one that changes budgets, because a company with excellent tools and nobody reading them looks identical to a company with nothing, right up until it matters. The blue team is the defense. The people watching the screens, tuning the alerts, and answering at 4 in the morning. We spent a whole episode with them earlier in this series. And in the last few years, a third phrase has become common, purple team, which is simply both sides in the same room while it happens. Red attacks, blue watches, and the two of them talk continuously. You lose the realism of surprise. You gain a defense that improves during the exercise rather than after it. There is no correct choice between these. There is only a correct order. Coverage first, because a company that cannot list its own systems is not ready to be hunted. Buy a red team engagement before a penetration test, and you will pay a great deal of money to be told dramatically something a checklist would have told you in a week. The finding will be true. You will simply have bought it at 4 times the price. Now the question this series exists to answer, and the one people type into a search box at 11 at night. How do you actually become one? There is no single door, and anybody who tells you there is one is usually selling the door. What there is instead is a set of routes that keep working, and one requirement all of them share. What every route has in common is a portfolio problem. This is a trust profession. Nobody hands a stranger a signed letter of authority on the strength of an interview. So the whole game is producing evidence that you can be trusted with access before anybody has given you any. The most common first route is sideways. System administrators, network engineers, help desk staff, developers. People who already know how a real organization is actually held together. That knowledge is worth more than it sounds, because the person who has spent 3 years keeping a fragile system alive knows precisely where the bodies are buried. The second route is the lab. You build systems at home deliberately badly, and you attack your own. It is legal because you own all of it, and it teaches faster than anything else. The third is competition. Capture the flag events, where organizers publish deliberately vulnerable systems and thousands of people race to solve them. They are free, they run constantly, and a public record of finishing them is exactly the kind of evidence that solves the trust problem. The fourth is bug bounty programs, where a company publishes, in writing, that it will pay for weaknesses reported responsibly under stated rules. And note what a bounty program actually is. It is that authorization letter published in advance to everybody. Same document, different distribution. Certifications sit alongside all of this. They are route, not the route. What they mainly do is get a stranger's application read by a human being. The ones the field takes most seriously are the practical ones, where you are given systems and a time limit and have to actually compromise them and write it up, which is the profession in miniature, including the write-up, and that is not a coincidence. The people who designed those examinations had all been handed reports they could not use, and they built the exam around the complaint. I will give you the 2 disqualifiers because they are consistent across the whole industry and nobody says them to beginners. The first is that you cannot write. If you cannot explain a finding to a tired manager in 1 paragraph, the technical skill behind it produces no value at all. The second is any history at all of testing something you did not have permission to test. Curiosity aimed at somebody else's system is the one thing that closes every door in this field permanently. Not because the industry is squeamish, because the entire product being sold is that you can be trusted with the keys, and that is not repairable. Everything else, every tool, every technique, every certificate can be learned later, and most of it will be obsolete twice over before your career ends anyway. That one thing cannot be undone. So what do you take from all of this, if you are never going to do this job and never intend to? First, if your organization has ever bought a penetration test, ask one question: who wrote the scope and what did they leave out? Scope is where a test is won or lost, and a comfortable scope produces a comfortable report, which is the most expensive kind of report there is. Second, if a phishing exercise ever reaches you, and it will, the number that matters is not whether you clicked. It is whether you told anybody. Report it even when you are almost certain it was the test, especially then. The habit is the defense, and the habit only forms by being used. Third, take the permission to be rude. Hanging up and calling back on a number you looked up yourself defeats nearly every pretext ever invented, and it costs you 9 seconds. If you manage people, say that out loud to them, in writing, this week. Most staff do not believe they are allowed to, and they are usually right about the workplaces they are in. Fourth, and this is the Adel lesson, before anybody relies on a permission, ask who actually owns the thing being permitted. That is not a security question. It is the same question behind every failed contract, every disputed handover, and every project that ends in a room full of lawyers. Who owned the thing? And did the person who said yes have the right to say it? 2 men found out the hard way that a real signature from the wrong organization is worth exactly nothing at 1 in the morning. Next Sunday on Secret Professions, the people who take the weapon apart afterwards. Malware, reverse engineers. Somebody has to open the thing that just took a hospital offline, line by line, and work out what it was actually for. That is a very strange way to spend a Tuesday, and it is somebody's whole career.